Welcome back to the channel, friends. Recently, I did a video on the Westminster Confession of Faith and God's permissive decree of sin. In it, I said that I would not go into the foreknowledge views as there's some diversity of thought there. But in this video, we're going to look at the foreknowledge of God, and we're going to do that by looking at French Reformed minister Louis Le Blanc and his view on it. Louis Le Blanc was a French Protestant minister and professor of theology at the Calvinist Academy of Sedan in the 17th century. And today we're going to be looking at work from his theological theses, and particularly his chapter on the concord of human freedom and divine decrees. In it, he explains different views of the foreknowledge of God, from Thomists to Jesuits to the Reformed and others. He then explains his position, which I find to be an interesting view and similar to other Reformed theologians such as Richard Baxter's view. So this video will be a basic overview of the view posited by Louis Le Blanc. Le Blanc begins by laying out a crucial foundation. First, it is certain, and as evident from the preceding, conceded by all, that nothing can be freely future under any condition or be known as such unless the condition under which it is said to be future includes God's decree not to withhold the concurrence necessary for the creature to act. Namely, all propositions about future conditionals must be explained and understood thus: this or that creature, placed in such and such an order of things, will do this or that, provided God wills to concur with it, as he usually does, and that he concurs is necessary for the creature to be able to elicit its action. So LeBlanc is saying that a creature can only act if God sustains its being and concurs with its action. In him we live, we move, and have our being, the scripture says. Essentially, God is the source of our movement. We can't act unless God concurs. So if God were to withhold that concurrence, the action would not be possible at all. So whenever we talk about what a creature might freely do in the future, we must include the condition that God will concur. This does not mean that God is behind our actions in a like directly causative way, only that God is the one sustaining us and giving us the ability to perform our actions. So for example, when we say, if Peter were in this circumstance, he would do X, that statement is only meaningful if we add the condition, provided God concurs with Peter's action as he usually does. Otherwise, Peter could not do anything. This doesn't mean God forces Peter's choice. It means that Peter cannot elicit any action without God sustaining and concurring power. So the whole point is that even with God's necessary concurrence, the action remains truly free. God's concurrence gives the action being and possibility, but it does not dictate the formality of the action, whether it's sinful or virtuous. That arises from the creature's own will. Thus, an act can be freely future, which is a free act that may occur as long as God wills not to withdraw his ordinary concurrence. So LeBlanc is insisting that whenever we talk about what a free creature would do, we must not picture them acting independently of God. God must always concur as the universal first cause. But since God usually concurs with secondary causes, according to their nature, we can still speak meaningfully of what someone would freely do in a certain situation, assuming God would decree to concur with their acts. LeBlanc continues, second, I also believe it should be conceded that all propositions about free and contingent future conditionals in which such a condition is understood are determinately true or false. At least, the recent Thomists and others who agree with them on this matter and who otherwise vehemently oppose middle knowledge cannot deny this. For according to their view, in order for the creature to act, it is necessary for God to pre-move and predetermine it. Given God's predetermination, the creature's action necessarily follows. According to their hypothesis, this conditional is infallible and necessary. If God wills to place such a creature in this or that state, and denies it nothing necessary for its action, it will do this or that, since that condition includes God's decree to predetermine it to act. So LeBlanc says that we must admit that all conditional statements about what a free creature would do are either true or false. they have a determinate truth value. For example, if Peter were placed in situation X, he would deny Christ. That's either true or false. It can't be both. He's showing that the Thomists, even though they reject Molina's middle knowledge, end up with a similar kind of true conditionals about future free acts. Only in their case, the condition always includes God's decree of premotion. So they can't deny that such conditional statements, future contingents under a condition, are determinately true or false. But that also reveals the tension. In their system, God's predetermination makes the act necessary in consequence. For Thomists, a creature cannot act unless God pre-moves and predetermines its will to a specific choice. So if God wills to place a creature in circumstance X and predetermines it to act, then the act necessarily follows. Thus, the conditional, if Peter were placed in situation X, he would do Y, is infallibly true because it includes God's predetermining decree. This makes the act necessary in consequence. Once God decides, the effect follows inevitably. LeBlanc pushes back here. He insists that God's concurrence need not be predetermining. Instead, God simply provides the general concurrence necessary for a creature to act at all, sustaining and enabling the act without fixing it to one direction. So for him, the same conditional, if Peter were placed in situation X, he would do Y, can still be determinately true without supposing a decree of premotion. So what grounds the truth of the conditional is that God would sustain Peter's action, general concurrence, but the direction, whether Y or not Y, comes from Peter as a free secondary cause. To him, this avoids making God the author of sin, since God's concurrence gives existence to the act, but not the formality of sin. Though I will note that the Thomist would distinguish and say that God is the cause of the material act of the sin, but not the formality of it. But as we will address later on, LeBlanc still doesn't find this satisfying. So, on LeBlanc's view, the conditional's truth depends on God's decree to concur ordinarily with free causes. He says, if someone says nothing is future except dependently on God's decree, and thus before God's decree, the thing is no more future than not future, but indifferent to being future or not future, and therefore neither can be truly affirmed of it, I respond, for a thing to be absolutely future, a certain decree of God is indeed required, on which its futurity depends. But for a thing not to be simply future, but only future under some condition, a decree that actually exists in God is not required. It suffices that a decree, according to the hypothesis, would be posited in God. Furthermore, it is certain and conceded by all that no truth of whatever kind escapes the divine intellect. Hence, since propositions about freely future contingents under the often mentioned condition have determined truth, they are also the object of divine knowledge. Therefore, God knows what each possible creature would do if he willed to place them in this or that state and deny them nothing necessary for action. When he says that nothing can be truly said to be future unless God has decreed it, before his decree things are indifferent, neither future or not future, this is basically the necessitarian position, that the futurity of anything depends directly and only on God's decree. So LeBlanc distinguishes, for something to be absolutely future, it will actually happen in reality. Yes, it does depend on a decree of God. Without the decree, nothing is absolutely future. But for something to be conditionally future, i.e., it would happen if a certain condition were fulfilled, no actual decree is required. It suffices that, hypothetically, if God decreed to put the creature in such and such circumstances and gave concurrence, then the outcome would follow. In other words, an absolute future requires a decree. A conditional future can be considered true without an actual decree, only with a hypothetical one. Since all truth is known to God, conditional future truths are also within his knowledge. Therefore, God knows what any possible creature would do if he were to place them in a certain circumstance and concur with their action. This gives God full knowledge of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, which may sound similar to Molinism, but LeBlanc frames it without adopting the Jesuit middle knowledge. Instead, he grounds it in God's natural omniscience. also referred to as simple knowledge or natural knowledge, which is a knowledge of all possibilities prior to his decree, and free knowledge, i.e., the knowledge of all that will actually take place. He later says that if you hold the Thomist view that creatures cannot act without God's prior predetermining concurrence, then you are already committed to admitting that God knows all conditional future truths. Why? Because once you suppose God's predetermination of a creature in a given circumstance, the outcome follows infallibly. And since God knows himself and his possible decrees perfectly, he cannot fail to know what any creature would do in any hypothetical circumstance. He notes that even Turretin grants this much. Turretin recognized that Suarez, a Jesuit Molinist, said conditional propositions about contingents, like if Peter were in situation X, he would do Y, always presuppose God's will, if he wills to cause it, permit it, or concur with it. Turretin concedes that understood this way, such conditionals can be accepted, though not in the Molinist sense of middle knowledge existing apart from the decree. So both sides agree God knows not only what will happen under his actual decrees, but also what would happen if he willed different decrees or concurrences. For LeBlanc, it is enough that God knows what creatures would do if he simply concurs with them ordinarily. He doesn't need to posit predetermining premotions for every possible action. LeBlanc essentially says that even if you insist on God's predetermining every action, you can't deny that God knows what would happen if he did so. So conditional future truths are real objects of divine knowledge. Turretin admits as much. But LeBlanc thinks you don't need such a heavy machinery as predetermination to explain it. God's ordinary concurrence is enough. He goes on to say, it is equally evident, according to the principles of the same doctors, that such knowledge by which God knows what any possible creature would do in this or that state, if he will to supply the necessary concurrence for action, exists in God before he has decreed anything about things. For before we conceive of God as decreeing anything, it is true that if God will to move and predetermine any creature by his concurrence to act, it would undoubtedly do that which it was moved and determined. And the truth of this proposition does not depend on any preceding decree of God, by which the connection of that possible decree with the event that would follow from it is determined. LeBlanc says that it is evident that God knows not only what will happen under his decrees, but also what would happen if he decreed otherwise. For instance, before God actually decrees anything, it is true to say, if God willed to move and predetermine a creature to act, that creature would certainly do what it was determined to do. That proposition is true whether or not God has decreed it, because it follows from the very nature of God's power and concurrence. This goes back to the distinction between absolute futurity, what will happen, which requires an actual decree of God, and conditional futurity, what would happen if God decreed, which does not require an actual decree, only the truth of the conditional itself, which God knows from eternity. So God's knowledge of conditionals is not dependent on him having decreed them. He eternally knows if I were to decree this concurrence, then this action would follow. He goes on to criticize the view that some held, which argued that before God decrees to make anything actually future, he first decrees all possible chain of events. If Adam is created and tempted, then he will necessarily fall. If David sees Bathsheba, he will necessarily lust, and so on for infinite possible worlds. This would mean God in eternity predetermined not just what will be, but every conceivable connection of sin and occasion in all possible worlds. LeBlanc calls this fictitious and unworthy because such decrees do nothing because they do not ground actuality, only hypothetical possibilities that may never exist. It would imply God decreed that sinful occasions necessarily result in sinful acts, making him the author of sin. And to say God positively decrees that temptation must necessarily issue in sin before decreeing creation itself makes him willing iniquity, which is impossible. Instead of this pre-decreeing all possible connections, LeBlanc argues that God knows the truth of conditionals directly in his intellect because he knows what free creatures would do under circumstances if he concurred. God doesn't need to decree those conditionals first in order to know them. Thus, God's knowledge of conditionals precedes his decrees. but his decrees to make actual futures determines what will in fact exist, and he avoids the problem of making God's will the necessary cause of sin. Thus far, we have two models here. The Thomistic model, that conditional is true only if it includes God's decree to pre-move and predetermine the act. Example, Peter would deny Christ if God predetermined him to do so. And the LeBlanc's natural knowledge of conditionals model. The conditional can be true with only God's concurrence, his general sustaining help, leaving Peter himself to determine the denial. Example, Peter would deny Christ if God concurred and left him to his own will. LeBlanc is saying that God knows what free creatures would do under certain conditions before he decrees anything. The only question is whether those conditions must always include God's predetermination or whether his ordinary sustaining concurrence is enough to ground the truth of conditionals. Thomists or strict determinists argue that no action can be truly future unless God decrees to pre-move and predetermine the will to that act. For them, a conditional like, if Peter is in this situation, he will deny Christ, is only true if God has decreed to move Peter's will that way. On this view, God's predetermination is the sole cause of the futurity of every action. LeBlanc objects that this collapses into making God the author of sin. If God predetermined every sinful act, like blasphemy or hatred of God, predetermining the will to a particular sinful act, then those evils would ultimately come from God's will, which is impossible. He insists that secondary causes can perform real actions that are not predetermined by God, while still being sustained by him. He maintains that God only needs to decree concurrence, that is, to uphold the creature's faculties so they can act. And this concurrence is indispensable. Without it, no creature can act at all. But it is indifferent in itself. It does not move the action one way or the other. The free secondary cause, the creature's will, determines the particular act. Therefore, conditional truths don't require God's predetermination. They can be grounded simply in the fact that if God concurs, then the free creature will act in this way. LeBlanc really takes issue with William Twist's view that every sinful futurity, its being future, must be caused solely by God's eternal decree and will. Since only God is eternal, he alone can cause futurity of events from eternity. So Adam's fall or the angels' rebellion had their futurity only because God decreed it so. LeBlanc says this makes God the author of sin. If God's decree is the sole cause of why Adam would disobey, then the sinful act itself is traced directly to God's willing, which he finds unacceptable. Futurity isn't some real thing that exists apart from the act itself. It's just a rational relation, a way of speaking about a thing that will exist in time. Example, saying Adam's fall was future doesn't mean there was an eternal thing called the futurity of Adam's fall floating around that needed a cause. It just means that Adam's fall, the event itself, was going to happen at a later point. So the cause of futurity isn't God's decree. It's the cause of the act itself. In Adam's case, his will misusing freedom. Futurity doesn't need a separate cause. He explains by stating that something is called past forever once it has happened, even though there's no eternal cause that makes it past. For example, the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD is now eternally past, but the cause of its being past is just the event itself happening in time. There's no need for an eternal cause to make it past. In the same way, something is called future forever before it happens, but the cause of its futurity is simply the cause that will bring it about in time. There's no need for a separate eternal cause of its being future. So Twist argued that the futurity is eternal. God has always known things as future. There must be an eternal cause for it, i.e. God's decree. LeBlanc replies that no, futurity isn't some separate thing that needs a special eternal cause. It's just a rational relation to the event itself. LeBlanc thinks if you treat futurity as something real that needs an eternal cause, you end up making God's decree the cause of every event, even sin. But if futurity is just a way of speaking about an event in relation to time, then its cause is the same as the event's cause, a creature's will in the case of sin. He goes on to explain, therefore, since God is not the cause of sin in time, it is far from the truth to say that God's will is the sole cause of the futurity of sin. That I simply and plainly believe it should be denied that it is the cause of this futurity, whether solely or along with a secondary cause. It is true indeed that man does not sin without depending on God's will, for he could not sin unless God permitted him to sin, and thus the futurity of sin depends on God's decree to permit the sin. But just as God's will is not therefore to be called the proper cause of man's actual sinning, so it does not follow that God's decree is the proper cause of the futurity of sin. LeBlanc draws a careful line here. God decrees to permit sin, so sin's futurity, its coming to be, depends on God's decree of permission. Sin would not be future if God had determined to hinder it. But permission does not make God the cause of the sin's futurity any more than permission makes him the cause of sin itself. So God's decree is a condition for sin's futurity, since nothing occurs outside of his will. But God's decree is not the cause of sin's futurity, since the cause of sin lies in the defect of the creature's will. Sin is only future because God permits it, but that doesn't mean his will causes it. Just as God's decree isn't the cause of man sinning in time, it's not the cause of sin's being future. The cause of sin's futurity is still in the sinner's will. LeBlanc later says, "For I would say, in the same way that God certainly foresees what would be freely future under some condition, because although the free cause would act otherwise, and that condition would not impose a necessity to the act, nonetheless it would actually act so. From the hypothesis that it would act so, it is necessary that it acts so when the condition is posed, and thus it is something that can be certainly known by God. This is the classical necessity of the consequence, not the necessity of the consequent. Necessity of the consequence is if God foreknows Peter will deny Christ, then necessarily Peter will deny Christ. Not the necessity of the consequent, which is it does not mean Peter's denial is necessary in itself, as he could not have done otherwise. The necessity is logical. It follows from the hypothesis, not metaphysical. It's not forced in the thing itself. So just as God knows what certainly will happen, God also knows with certainty what would happen under a given condition. For example, if Peter were placed in situation X, then Peter would freely do Y. Even though Peter could act otherwise, because his will remains free and contingent, once the hypothesis is fixed, Peter would do Y in situation X. Then it necessarily follows that Peter would do Y in that condition. This is again a necessity of the consequence, a logical necessity, not a necessity in the act itself. The act remains contingent and free, but from the hypothesis, Peter would do Y, it follows necessarily that he would do Y. Thus, the proposition has a definite truth value, true or false, which God knows infallibly. If something is truly future, then it is necessarily future in that sense because what God foresees can't fail to happen. But that doesn't mean the event itself isn't necessary by nature. It's still contingent and free. LeBlanc says, therefore, I see no reason to deny that God has a knowledge of what would be freely future under certain condition, even if that condition does not include a decree to predetermine the free cause to this or that action. And if there are any arguments that seem to overturn this knowledge, such as the incomprehensibility of how God infallibly knows something future that might not be, those arguments also conflict with the foreknowledge of contingents that are absolutely future, which, however, the Word of God places beyond all doubt in God. Even if a free action is only future under a condition, example, if Peter were in situation X, he would do Y, God can still know it with certainty. The condition doesn't have to include a decree of predetermination. It just needs to suppose the possibility of God providing the concurrence necessary for the act. Some argue, if something might not be, how can God infallibly know it? LeBlanc replies that this objection undermines not just conditionals, but also God's knowledge of absolute contingents, things that will happen but are contingent. Since Scripture clearly affirms God's certain knowledge of contingent events, like human acts that truly could have gone otherwise, the same reasoning applies to conditional futures. So LeBlanc says God not only knows what will happen, but also what would happen if certain conditions were met, even if those conditions never occur. These truths are real, and certain in God's knowledge without needing him to predetermine every free act. It's important to note that God's knowledge of Adam's sin does not make his understanding depend on Adam, except insofar as Adam is the object of knowledge. God knows it as his object, but his knowledge doesn't depend on creatures in origin or causality. The creature doesn't cause God's knowledge. God eternally knows all things, but his knowledge terminates on the creature as object. Now, as we are coming up on the end here, let's take a look at how it nicely fits within the Westminster Confession of Faith, chapters 3, section 1 and 2. Here's the Westminster Confession of Faith in full, chapter 3, section 1. God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. Yet so, as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of creatures, nor is the liberty of contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. First is the universal decree, and watch my last video to get more details on how this ordination relates to sin. So God ordains all things whatsoever comes to pass. This is absolute, comprehensive, and eternal. Next is the mode of decree. It is freely and unchangeably ordained. Nothing outside God compels him, and his decree is not mutable. And here are the guardrails. God is not the author of sin. Creaturely will is not coerced. And secondary causes, like natural laws, free choices, etc., are not overridden, but established. LeBlanc fits here in key ways. He affirms God ordains everything, but distinguishes, like the rest of the Reform, in the modes of causation, efficient versus permissive. Sin is foreknown and decreed permissively, not caused, and therefore he's not the author of sin or offering violence to the will. And he insists in secondary causes retain real contingency. That's exactly what Westminster Confession of Faith stresses. Liberty and contingency of second causes are established, not erased. Now, here's section 2 from the same chapter. Although God knows whatsoever may or can come to pass upon all supposed conditions, yet hath he not decreed anything because he foresaw it as future, or as that which would come to pass upon such conditions. The confession explicitly affirms that God knows whatsoever may or can come to pass upon all supposed conditions. This is exactly what LeBlanc insists upon. God knows what creatures would freely do under any given set of conditions, provided he concurs. But the decree is not caused because he saw things as future. The Confession of Faith guards against the Arminian and Molinist move by clarifying that God's decree does not depend on foresight. He doesn't decree because he foresaw. Rather, he decrees sovereignly and freely, though his decree encompasses what he knows in his natural knowledge. LeBlanc rejects grounding God's decree in foresight of those conditionals. Instead, like the confession, he insists that the decree is free, wise, and sovereign, not reactive. To close out, LeBlanc ends this chapter with the following. But certainly we should not presume so much of ourselves as to dare to limit divine knowledge and deny that God knows something because we cannot comprehend how he knows it. For the divine intellect, being altogether infinite, undoubtedly knows more than we can grasp and attain. At least the one who thinks that God knows things that perhaps are not knowable errs less dangerously than the one who denies that God knows what he truly knows and what is within the object of his divine omniscience. So that's an overview of his view. Hopefully you enjoyed it and gave you something to think about. If you want to learn more, I'll leave his theological theses in the description, alongside links to Baxter on the same subject. Make sure you like and subscribe. I want to know your thoughts on this video, so leave a comment below, and peace be with you.